Travel expert Eoghan Corry joins us now, and Eoghan, a very serious story that our listeners are following and they're wondering what's going on. Belarus accused of hijacking a European jetliner and engaging in an act of state terrorism by forcing a Ryanair flight to perform an emergency landing. Very serious stuff going on here, Eoghan. Can you give us a little bit of background as to what's happened and why, maybe?
This doesn't generally happen, Emer. They, if you go back through the years, the number of times that we've seen a passenger flight forced to change route like this, you could more or less count it on one hand. And people who got on their Ryanair flight FR4978 yesterday, expecting to go to Vilnius, had this very bizarre scenario played out, where there seems to have been a conversation of some time between the pilot and the air traffic control, and then the flight, you can follow its path on Flight Radar 24, replay it. It diverted into Minsk, and obviously listeners will be aware of the high political drama that ensued. And the reaction of the world. And it's quite interesting. I mean, it's a Ryanair flight. It's special to Ireland. Ryanair are part of what we are. But this is a huge world issue. Push notifications on my phone in all the different languages this morning are all coming in on this particular story.
The response has to be very tough. It has to be very clear. We've heard that from Minister for Foreign Affairs, Simon Coveney, this morning. Or if not, I suppose it'll just reinforce to the decision makers in Belarus that they've done the right thing.
There's a little bit of kettles and pots here. As always in a big international incident like that, everybody says this is disgraceful. But we have really got to define what civil aviation's rights are passing over airspace. A lot of the airlines of Europe last night immediately diverted all of their flights away from Belarusian airspace. The Ryanair obviously will take the internationally agreed route between two locations, and they would not have expected Belarus to be an aggressive airspace, as has happened in this case. But we've seen America do this in the past. We've seen a very spectacular row that lasted 4 years between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, where all the Qatar flights had to divert around Saudi Arabian airspace. This is pretty new. In the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen airspace turned into a sort of a weapon, and there are loads and loads and loads of questions just on the aviation side of this, Emer. And I'm not going into all the politics. Like the airwaves are full, as I say, push notifications full of the political implications of this. But what does an airline do when you have a belligerent regime forcing it for political reasons to divert? And there's no doubt nobody is taking seriously the reason that was put out by Minsk, that there was explosives on board, according to one report, which would have given them more of a right to divert it to Minsk, or a bomb on board, in which case... This is really important, Emer. The aircraft was nearer to Vilnius than it was to Minsk. Where if there was a bomb on board, you go to the nearest airport. Like Ryanair has had bomb hoax, not many, but it's a huge airline, so it's had 2 or 3 down the years false bomb hoaxes. None of them are a bomb, and had to divert in one particular case close to home, to Edinburgh, about 8 years ago. But you do go to the nearest airport. There was clearly so many factors here that have to be unravelled. But the key one, from where Michael O'Leary, who is absolutely fuming over this, from where aviation is looking, is how do we protect civil aviation, ordinary people flying about their business, from being caught up in false bomb threats and diversions, which are purely based on people using their airspace like that.
Okay. Do we know, Eoghan, if the reports are true that KGB officials were on the Ryanair plane?
Not sure if there were KGB officials on the Ryanair plane. There is some suggestion that 6 people got off, 1 the journalist, 1 his partner, and 4 others. One of the papers saying that they were known KGB, no way of verifying that. What we're getting a lot is from Svetlana, obviously Svetlana, who is the leader of the opposition. Belarus has a very strong Irish connection. Some listeners will be aware. She was spent her teenage summers in Ireland, but with the opposition body of who have been tweeting say that somebody in the airport in Athens attempted to photograph the documents of the journalist who was the target of this entire operation, and before he took off, and then disappeared from the crowd. But what they seem to have done is verified that he was on the flight, and there was about 2 weeks earlier where another of Svetlana's activists took the same flight. He was tweeting last night saying that maybe this is what triggered it. They saw this as the opportunity. It doesn't go over. It goes over Belarus. The flight goes over Belarusian airspace for quite a considerable period of time. At the latter leg of the journey, and Belarus saw that as an opportunity.
And what about aircraft overflying Belarus now in general? Are there any concerns about that?
Yeah, very big concerns. As I say, a lot of them diverted last night. I think that there will be a lot of reassurances sought from Belarus that this won't happen again. But as I say, it's kettles and pots. I mean, with this extraordinary situation where a journalist who was covering left-wing issues in Cuba, particularly on an Air France flight, the Americans didn't force it to land, but they denied permission for an Air France flight to pass over American airspace between Mexico and France because of one person on board. That was an outrage at the time, and it wasn't tackled at the time, probably because America is such diplomatic clout. But we have got to start confronting governments using airspace for little petty point scoring. Somebody's written something that you don't like. In this case, it was a journalist. In that case, it was a journalist. I'm a journalist. I do have a personal concern about this because a lot of people in the sort of media world are finding themselves in no-fly lists and in situations where they're being taken off aircraft and occasionally arrested, as in this case.
And back to the passengers finally arriving in Vilnius. And had they any sense of what was going on, Eoghan, when they disembarked? Did they know the story by then, or
absolutely?
Have you any
idea? There was nothing. No, I'm not sure what the conversation between the pilot and air traffic control was, but there was a MiG jet, a fighter jet, sent to escort the aircraft, so nobody was in any doubt that they were being diverted for security reasons, and it was very clear what had happened as soon as they landed. First of all, it was all over Twitter. The passengers on the aircraft were tweeting photographs themselves, and the president of Lithuania met the aircraft on its landing and declared, his condemnation, his utter condemnation, because Lithuania's airspace, flights, anything coming from south is going over Belarusian airspace. It's big implications for those Baltic states. It's also big implications for connectivity through Asia, for the whole of Central Europe, those important countries like Germany. So passengers were in no doubt as to the seriousness of the situation. Ryanair were on top of the situation at home. Interestingly, at home, their own statement, which Alejandro Ruiz issued yesterday evening, didn't mention the fact that there was a military aircraft that they were forced to divert. It did it almost like in the usual consumer session. There was a 5-hour delay. We apologise to our passengers, but I can tell you they're fuming. I can tell you they're fuming. Yeah.
Okay. Well, moving on to other travel issues, Eoghan, and a huge concern to many of our listeners, and I know you're following it closely, but the restrictions and what's happening next. And the Minister for Foreign Affairs, who we mentioned earlier there, this morning he was saying he hopes Ireland will be able to benefit from removing restrictions on international travel at some point in July, he said.
Yeah, it's very simple here, Emer. It's not that complicated. Europe's going to open and then we're going to open if Europe's opening doesn't cause problems. It could be a 4-week delay, it could be a 6-week delay. The time frame for Europe has moved forward on Thursday by the European Commission into June. Portugal has already opened, Greece has already opened, Spain has announced an opening from July the 7th. That means that PCR restrictions are removed. On the Spanish side, if you fly to Spain at the moment, you need to take a PCR test. I had to take one myself because I was out at that Madrid event that Pedro Sanchez made that announcement last week. Another Irish connection, Emer, by the way, is Pedro Sanchez learned his English as a teenager in Ireland, and it's really when he's talking in English you can pick up some idioms and pronunciations from Ireland. He's very, very fond of Ireland, but he made that announcement of July the 7th being the opening of Spain, and on our side we haven't gone that far yet. We still only want essential travel, and that's the official public health policy. And that will probably change about 3 or 4 weeks later than the rest of Europe. We're more cautious than the rest of Europe. I've been very critical of that for many reasons.
Mandatory quarantine, you've been hugely critical of that.
That's a series of scandals, Emer. There's no other phrase you could use for it. But going back to where we are, will we be able to travel this summer? Aer Lingus have introduced a fairly flexible booking policy where you will get a free flight change our money back for flights booked up to the end of the year. Ryanair is still protecting its summer. You can get it up to June, but not later. But the other interesting thing is the airlines have held their shape and held their nerve, and there's a very ambitious schedule of flights in the system. For instance, we've 4 new routes we didn't have in 2019. We've got Rhodes, we've got Santorini, Rhodes from Ryanair, Santorini from Aer Lingus, we've got Antalya from Turkish Airlines, and we've got Essex from Aer Lingus Regional or Aer Lingus. So the airlines have put the schedule in place in the hope that the restrictions will be removed. Everybody's talking about Europe being opening end of June, July. We will kick in maybe 4 or 6 weeks later, and that probably ties in with what Simon Coveney said this morning. But it's a very simple process. They'll move first. We'll watch the figures. If there isn't a mishap, we're going to follow.
We'll have to see what happens. We'll watch with interest. Thanks as always, Eoghan, for your
time.
Always
a great pleasure, Emer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eoghan Corry there joining us, keeping us up to date with what's happening travel-wise.